Hello, everybody, and welcome to a short mini lecture here on how the body is organized. Okay, and so you're going to be learning a lot more about atoms and molecules and how they build large molecules in our body, and how those large molecules in the body are actually the building blocks for those tiny organs inside of our cells called organelles. Then within cells, we have these organelles, okay? And cells now takes us to sort of the unit that we are in, where we're learning that cells, the most basic unit of a living thing, will come together to build tissues. And these tissues and the four special types of tissues in the body, which we're going to learn about in this little mini lecture, come together to build organs, things like your heart, brain, lungs, and reproductive organs. And because they don't just exist all alone and independent in the body, they're actually a part of an even more complex component called an organ system, where we might actually have the interaction of many organs working together to carry out a very specific job that ultimately will help the organism to stay alive. So, first, let's remember that we're going from the least complex to the most complex. So if we start at the cell is the smallest, least complex form of life. Not to say that it's not extremely complex in terms of what's going on there. So it's the smallest form of life. And we can find them in two major categories, including animal cells, which you and me are made out of, and plant cells, which are a huge component of the biosphere or the sphere of all living things. We can see that the animal cell is rounder and it has different organelles or tiny organs inside of it than you would find in a plant cell. So, for example, this plant cell, which also, by the way, we're going to see in terms of structure, it's going to be more rectangular in shape, and also more rigid because it has something called a cell wall that animal cells don't have. It also is going to have some other really important defining features like chloroplasts, which help do the work of photosynthesis. We're not going to find those chloroplasts in an animal cell because we don't photosynthesize. So, we can take these cells that have very specific jobs in an organism, we can group them commonly to do a larger task, to do a bigger job, right? One cell is not going to be able to do the same amount of work and function as a huge grouping of the same type of cell building this um, structure called a tissue. So, a tissue is simply a group of cells that work together to do a job or a function. And when they work together, they can perform a much larger job than the cell could have done by itself. So, in terms of the different types of tissues that we're going to encounter in our body, we're going to encounter something called connective tissue. And connective tissue is going to be the types of tissues that form things like our bones. We have epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue are the types of tissues that cover surfaces. And so the lining of our stomach or skin cells, for example, could all be considered epithelial. And you can see they kind of stack on top of each other. Then we have muscle tissues. You can see there's these kind of long striations in muscle tissue. And we're going to talk about why that would be really, really important for many muscle cells coming together to build a muscle tissue and why it needs to have some sort of elasticity or stretchiness to it. Then finally, we have nerve tissue. made of a collection of many neurons or single nerve cells. And each tissue can be recognized based on their structure and shape. Connective tissue looks very different than epithelial tissue, and they have totally different functions. Their structure is different and their function is different. So, now let's talk about what happens when you get a group of tissues that work together to do a job or a function. We call that an organ. So, let's use the stomach as an example. The stomach isn't just made of epithelial, essentially stomach cells. It also contains red blood cells. It has nervous cells or nerve cells. It has loose connective tissue, and it also has smooth muscle tissue. All of these different types of tissues are coming together. And even though they're totally different in terms of their independent function or job, they're going to work together to do a common job. And the stomach is going to do some really important functions related to digestion. So, some other organs that you're going to want to record, an example could be the heart, the lungs, which are responsible for respiration or the exchange of gas with the environment, the stomach, responsible for the breakdown and digestion of food and the removal of nutrients, the brain, which is the control center of really the entire body, or we have the kidneys, a really important organ that helps with filtration of the blood. So, an organ system is the place in which organs work together to do a common job. So, a group of organs that work together to do a job, we consider this an organ system. So, some examples of organ systems in the body that we'll further explore in our class are the circulatory system, or the system of blood vessels and arteries that help circulate blood around the body, delivering oxygen to all the different components and regions of our body. We have the respiratory system that's actually taking in that oxygen that our circulatory system is going to move around. Digestive system, removal of nutrients from food, the breakdown of nutrients from food, and ultimately the release of the waste products. We have the nervous system. We have the skeletal system, hugely important for structural support, protection of our organs, allowing us to move around, um, allowing us to, essentially not just be a blob of skin on the ground. So let's look at how a group of organs is working together to do this job that takes place in the circulatory system. Okay, so in the circulatory system, we have a whole bunch of different organs that are really, really important within that system. Main one being the heart. Okay, and let's kind of go into decreasing the level of complexity, right? If the heart is within the circulatory system, this heart has to be made out of tissue. It's made out of cardiac tissue. It's a very specialized muscle tissue. And then that cardiac muscle tissue is going to be made out of cardiac cells. So when we take all of these different organ systems and we have them working together, we're able to complete the characteristics of a living thing. So we have an orchid flower here, a tarantula, and I'm forgetting the name of this frog. It's a tree frog. It's an Amazon tree frog. Um, all of them have unique organ systems that are not working independently. They're actually working together to allow the organism to survive. So, some examples of organisms in which you can record are things like a human, a dog, a tree, or a mushroom. So, in terms of, again, this concept of going from simple, going from the cellular level to a full blown organism, we call this the levels or hierarchy of organization, starting with the internal parts of a cell, those tiny organs inside the cell. And then those organelles are within a cell, a little bit more complex than an organelle by itself. Those animal cells will come together to form tissues. A group of tissues is more complex than one cell by itself. Those tissues, again, come together to build an organ. And an organ, because it could be made of a whole bunch of different types of tissues, is going to be more complex than the tissue by itself. The organ system, where that organ resides, is going to be more complex than the organ itself. And then, of course, the full blown organism is going to be the most complex. So, as you fill your notes down, right, you're going to be going from simplest at the top, small and simple on your notes. That's the cell circle. And it goes down to tissue, to organ, and then finally, the most complex being the organ system and organism.